Hello, I am Darrell Parrish Bakeman, and I happen to be in Southern Arizona in the city of Tucson. And I am delighted to present to you not only myself, but my partner in this conversation, Bonnie Heidler, who is a part of the leadership team in our legislative district, which is LD17. Hello, Bonnie.
Hey, Darrell.
And today we have a guest speaker, which we'll introduce in a minute, who is here with us today to talk about a subject that is very important, especially in this 2024 election cycle, and that is democracy. A lot of people hear that word used a lot, probably have their own mind made up on what that means or does not mean. And this discussion today will maybe help you get more information on what's most important when you hear that word. So I'm going to ask Bonnie to introduce our guest today, who is Michael Hayes. And Bonnie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Darrell. It's my honor to introduce Michael D. Hayes, who is a retired research vice president at communications research and consulting firm Frank N. Magid Associates. Prior to joining Magid, Michael taught political science at the University of Detroit and polled for Democratic candidates in Michigan. Mike earned a BA from the University of Iowa, an MA from the University of Wisconsin, and a PhD from the University of Maryland in political science, where his doctoral dissertation focused on American political realignments. He is also, with co-author Morley Winograd, the author of 3 books on the millennial generation: Millennial Makeover in 2008, Millennial Momentum in 2011, and Millennial Majority in 2013. Mike, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you, and we're really happy that you were able to make a presentation at the Legislative District 17 here in Tucson at our general meeting. It was really one of the most well-received presentations that we've had, Michael. And I think that's because the subject matter is on the hearts and minds of so many people these days. And so I want to start this conversation with us talking about what democracy is. And if you could help us with that, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Darrell, and thank you, Bonnie. Um, Democracy, if you go back into political theory, um, democracy at its base is ruled by the people, ruled by the mass, ruled by the majority of people. If you go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, they actually thought democracy was not a very good thing because it would talk about mob rule. That's the way they conceived of it. And even to some degree, our founders in the United States had that point of view. So they sort of watered down what we can think of as the democratic institutions. That's why we have an electoral college rather than a straightforward popular vote for president. That's why we have a Senate that is 2 senators per state rather than the portion based on the population of each state and so on. But throughout American history, we have moved in a direction toward more democratic institutions. Historically, and one of the crucial aspects of democracy is that the majority of voters gets to decide who holds offices in the United States. And throughout history, what we have done is actually broaden who can vote in elections. At the very beginning, it was only property owners. And so there were a very small number of people who could actually vote. That that designation was eliminated fairly early. There were in some states, actually religious tests. One had to be a Christian or a Protestant. And so in some early states, Catholics and Jews, for example, were not permitted. Again, early in the 19th century, that went by the wayside. There were obviously racial barriers to democracy, to who could vote, and uh, technically they disappeared with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, but it really wasn't until the 1960s with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that it became permissible in all the states in the Union, including the Deep South, that African Americans would be permitted to vote. Although even today, there are attempts made to limit that by a variety of means, not overtly, but by rules such as trying to forbid Sunday voting, that kind of thing. And of course, it wasn't until the 1920 election that women were permitted to vote in the United States. And then it wasn't until the 1960s that people under 21, so 18-year-olds, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds were permitted to vote. So now we have a situation where pretty much every adult American is permitted to vote in elections. And so that's part one of democracy. But beyond that, there is also the basic idea of individual freedom, which is absolutely crucial to democracy. People having rights, a variety of different rights, rights to free speech, to free press, and the freedom of religion, and so on. And we're still fighting a lot of those battles as to determining exactly what that means. For example, what the freedom of religion means. Does that mean that all religious activities are permitted? Does that allow government to be involved in the area of religion? And we're obviously fighting that through. But at this point, I think democracy means rule by the majority. People have individual liberties, individual rights. And to a large degree, I believe that the Democratic Party has done its best, certainly since the 1960s, to expand what democracy means, to broaden the people who can vote, to provide the greatest amount of individual liberty that is possible and consistent with safety. And the other party is being a little more restrictive these days.
So you're saying that voting and freedom are the key issues when we look at democracy. And
That is, that's, yes, that is what I believe, Jarrell. Those
and
are the key
those
issues,
are the key issues, and this year,
or the key attributes of democracy.
that's for sure. And this year we're saying there are threats to these freedoms, threats to these rights that people need to pay attention to, or else these freedoms and rights could leave us. Can we speak to that a little bit so we can
Certainly.
ensure that
Um,
people understand what is at stake?
sure. Um, I'm 80 years old. I'm going to be 81 in July. And so I've seen a fair number of presidential elections. I actually voted for the first time. I was at that point, I couldn't vote until I was 21. And my first election was in 1964 when I proudly voted for Lyndon Johnson against Arizona's own Barry Goldwater. And I've seen a fair number of elections over that period of time. And very frequently we hear, this is the most crucial election of our lifetimes. This is the most crucial election in American history. And to use one of President Biden's favorite words, um, sometimes that's hyperbole. But this year it isn't hyperbole, because this year we truly have democracy on the ballot. We are dealing with a candidate on the Republican side that is a threat to democracy, and it was very clearly evident, among other places, on January 6th, 2021,
Mhm.
when he led what is clearly an insurrection to try to thwart the will of a majority of the American people. Not only did a solid majority of people vote for President Biden in the popular vote, but President Biden had a pretty clear-cut victory in the Electoral College. And his opponent, really from the beginning, even during the course of the campaign, was saying that he wasn't, unless he won, unless Trump won, he would not necessarily accept the results of what was proven to be and shown by court case after court case, a free, honestly contested election in which President Biden won and former President Trump did not win.
So now that is history. But what we have right now is not only that same candidate winning the primary in most states that had the option to vote for a Republican over the primary season and securing the nomination to be on the considered to be on the ballot in November. His party and many of the people in his party are clearly supporting him in spite of what you just said. And I'd like to know, both from Michael and Bonnie, why this is such a big threat and why we need to speak to it today as we have this conversation.
Bonnie, you want to give it a shot first, or you want me to go?
You go first.
Well, um, I think the reason that a fair number, that really the large majority of Republicans, I would say 2/3 to 3/4, are supporting this is because they are definitely Donald Trump loyalists. Um, and they are willing, unfortunately, to give up what I think would be their liberties in order to protect security on their own thinking. I think a lot of them are very afraid of, I mean, it has been a key element in the Trump campaign, both in 2016 and in 2020, immigration. His position has been that immigrants, and it's his own words, are poisoning the blood of America. They are a threat to the American way of life, and and so many of his supporters are accepting that point of view. They're frightened about that point of view, uh, about basically Trump's point of view. He has emphasized crime, that crime is tremendously increasing in all across the country, but particularly in cities run by Democrats. And so those are his threats. Recently, the Economist YouGov poll indicated that the American public was kind of evenly divided in its worldview. There was about half of the electorate takes a worldview that things are really just falling apart, that we are unsafe, we are not secure, and in effect that this needs to be dealt with. And if it means that we have to lose some of our rights to do that, well, that would be the case. And then the other half accepts the point of view, no, it's very different. Most people are inherently good, and we need to be inclusive and work together for a better end. Not surprisingly, given the way people have been going the last several years, Republicans tend to take the more negative, fearful point of view, and Democrats and liberals take the more positive point of view. So I think a lot of it does come down to a desire for security from all these supposed threats that that Trump is talking about, and so there is a need for Democrats to be able to fight back against this thing, not only to point out the dangers of a Trump administration, but also to point out the positive things that can come from a second Biden administration.
Do you want to respond now, Bonnie, to that?
Yeah, and I think that we've seen this story play out before in history, not our history, but in history. When Hitler came to power, he used the same exact tactics
Oh my God.
that Mike just laid out. He created fear for the other. And that's exactly what Donald Trump is doing is creating fear, making us feel not secure in the United States any longer. Unfortunately, that will be a problem if he got into power, because he's going to make this very much like, Hitler's Germany was, and many of our freedoms and rights will be taken away. And that's a very high cost to pay.
It's a big cost to pay. What we're talking about, usually we politicos always look at a good candidate or a decent candidate and what the issues are. Mike even mentioned, oh, immigration, new crime. But what you really said underneath what you were talking about, Mike, if I can I call you Mike? Are you okay with that?
You certainly can. I
Okay.
prefer that.
Okay. Is how people feel. That we usually don't look at how we feel. We look at these issues, we meaning Democrats, and what we think is most important. And we used to see ourselves as this shining country on the hill. And from the happiness study last week that we're at the bottom of the barrel because people don't feel great. And I'm just want to kind of go with that for a minute here because we're not responding to how people feel and giving them any reason to feel better. That's usually an emotional response. And I'm wondering if that's something we can do something about. How can we help people feel better? We just came out of COVID. It was awful. We have a high degree of mental health among our youth. They don't feel good. They don't respond as our generation responded to the occurrences of the day. And I think, especially with having you on this call, Michael, who spent a lot of time researching young people and their attitudes and their responses, you have a better sense of how they're feeling. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on what we can do to help our young electorate feel better and maybe our whole electorate
Well,
feel better.
one thing I could say, Darrell, is that at least if you look at the survey that the Economist you and YouGov did, that young voters, those 18 to 29, and actually going beyond that from 30 to say 44, 45, are actually the most optimistic part of the electorate. They are optimists. They do believe things can be better. And if you look at those generations, they are the most diverse generations in American history. Um, they are, if not female driven generations, they're certainly generations where there's a greater degree of gender equality
Mhm.
than there has been in the past. Um, and so they tend to be fairly optimistic. They are accepting of other people. And so I think one of the places where the Democratic Party has always been successful, I compiled a list, I won't go through the whole long list of Democratic campaign slogans since Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, and where we've done well, and it was FDR, and it was JFK, and it was Lyndon Johnson, and Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, and now Joe Biden, is actually on the positive side. Um, FDR's slogan, beyond happy days are here again, in his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention in 1932 is or was, um, we have nothing to fear but fear itself.
Mm.
And that has been a Democratic um, stronghold. And so, yes, we have to point out the downsides of a potential Trump presidency, but we also have to talk about what good things can come and will come and have come, in fact, from the Biden presidency. Um, you mentioned some of the concerns, and here it's fascinating. Crime rates have been going down for quite a while. The economy is in much better shape now than it was when Joe Biden took office in 2021. And while there certainly are concerns, and you're on the southern border with things that are going on there, actually immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit far less crimes than native born Americans. And yet there is this great fear that is being engendered, and it just isn't warranted by the facts. And so my sense of this is that we have to be both warning, we have to give warning, but we also have to talk about something good that is going to come from Democratic victories and from a Joe Biden victory. Just trying to frighten people alone isn't enough.
Well, I want to get that list of all the great slogans, so I want you to
I can send it to you. I'll be happy to send it
I
to
want
you.
to be reminded of all the good slogans. You
Well,
know,
I can say honestly, except for FDR, and I was 2 years old when he passed away, but I was around for all of those. So,
yeah. So, and Biden doesn't have a slogan. He needs a
well,
slogan.
he actually did in the last campaign. I mean, it was, looking forward. Our best days are ahead of us, things like that. So, but I'll send you the list. I can do it after this call.
We need to have a contest on Biden's slogan for the campaign because we do need to get this positive energy out. And I think you're onto something.
And also beyond that, I think we need to emphasize the key issues that are drivers for young people, and in fact for both younger and older Democrats. They agree on what's important, and they agree on how to deal with those issues. Obviously, one of the key issues is reproductive freedom, or straightforward, protecting abortion rights. Both older and younger Democrats feel that's very important. Climate change is obviously an issue of great importance. And, so there are a whole variety, a whole list of issues that, again, Democrats, both old and young, care a great deal about. And I also want to make one other point, that while it is true that about 2/3 to 3/4 of Republicans buy into Trump's stuff, um, if you look at the results of the primaries, there
Primaries.
are significant numbers who continue to vote for Nikki Haley, who
Yes,
is no liberal by any means,
right.
but continued to vote for her even after she was out of the race. They were registering their own protest.
Yeah,
And
17% in Arizona.
yeah,
Almost
I mean,
18,
and
almost
again,
18, actually. Yeah.
yeah, and it was even a greater number in Pima County.
Yes,
um,
the
and,
smart
and in
county.
Maricopa County as well. So so there are Republicans who can be won over, who are concerned about the end of democracy and what a Trump presidency would bring. Again,
So,
they don't have to be, they're not necessarily going to be liberal. They may not vote Democratic after this, but they, I think, recognize the dangers.
well, I want to come back to this, but I want to mention something that was in an article that you wrote with the Brookings, or for the Brookings Institution, that kind of drew me to being able to know who you are. And in that article, you mentioned the motto for this country, which was a pluribus unum, which is together one. If I'm not mistaken, that's not the exact translation, but that's the
Right.
concept. And I looked that up, and that motto changed in 1956 under the Republican president Eisenhower.
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 Had to think about who it was then. And and it changed to "In God We Trust." And from that, we started seeing more and more conservative Republican right-leaning people interjecting religion, which we took out when we came over here and created this country, back into the landscape of democracy. And I'd like to just have a few conversations or reactions to this particular fact because I think it speaks to where we are now, right now. So if I could have some feedback on that, I'd love it.
Well, when I mentioned it earlier, the whole question of what freedom of religion means. Um, there are a number of different points of view on what, based on the court decisions on what it's supposed to mean. One would be that there's a wall of separation, that religion is on one side, politics is on the other. People can worship freely in any way they prefer, and it shouldn't be involved in the governmental process. Then there are other people who would argue, well, religion can be involved as long as there's no preference among all the various religions. Um, but then there seems to be and that might be something one could deal with. Um, Back in that same era, in the 1950s, we changed from the notion of a Christian nation to the Judeo-Christian ethic, that somehow um, Jews were allowed into the structure of all of this. But that would even go, that may have worked in the 1950s when there were only essentially two significant religious groupings, either Christians of one kind or another or Jews. But now we have a much more diverse society where there are Muslims, there are significant numbers of Hindus, Buddhists, and even more than that, about a third of the public, and particularly younger people
Nothing.
who don't identify with
No
any religious
affiliation at
faith
all. Right.
there. And so I'm not sure that even the no preference doctrine works. And then what we have is, unfortunately, a fair number of people who are now talking about some sort of variation of Christian nationalism, that this is a Christian nation and Christian notions. And again, there's disagreement among Christians as to exactly what that means, but Christian traditions, biblical traditions, should be enacted in our laws. And um, so, I think personally, we're much more safe if we just do the wall of separation. Religion on the one hand, people can worship as they see fit, and government politics on the other hand. We'll talk about how this goes, and court decisions will be involved in it. But at least to some degree, it does appear that the current Supreme Court is going through that wall or over that wall. Um, Clearly, on the Dobbs decision, that seemed to have been the case, and there may be other things that may be coming along as well. If you take Clarence Thomas at his word, that he's talking about the possibility of making same-sex marriage not unconstitutional, and um, contraception. So I think that in part is on the ballot here. What kind of where religion fits into American life, and I think there are obviously partisan divisions on that as well.
Well, one thing for sure is religious freedoms go both ways, both the freedom to believe or not to believe. And
Exactly.
within that, you can believe what you want to believe, but you can't tell me not to believe what I believe. And that's why the issue of democracy and freedom is so joined together in so many ways. And I don't think
Right.
people look at it like that. And we don't want to
Or
get
not to believe at all if you don't want to believe.
that's for
I
sure.
mean, if you don't, I'm not doing that in a flip way.
Mhm.
Um, but we increasingly, again, we have at least a third of the American public. We have gone in my lifetime from a nation that was, according to Gallup polls, about 97% of the people in the country believed in one faith or another. The large majority, about I would say 95%, agreed in some degree in some Christian religion.
Mhm.
About I think about 2/3 of those were Protestant, 1/3 were Catholic of that, and maybe 4 or 5% were Jewish, and only 2 or 3% of the public said they didn't have a religious faith.
Mhm.
And during this period, we now have a situation where, again, about a quarter to a third of the public doesn't have a religious affiliation.
Mhm.
And Protestants, which used to be a majority, are now less than a majority of
True.
the American population. And that includes both white Protestants and Protestants of color. And so the country has changed. And it just, but yes, I think that is a freedom and it's particularly important to young voters, but also I think to Democrats as well. And it doesn't mean that Democrats are anti religion. It doesn't mean that Democrats don't believe that people should worship. It
Mhm.
just says you make your choice. It's your choice, and you can worship any way you want to worship, or not worship at all. You can affiliate any way you want to, or not affiliate at all. And just other people can make their own choices.
Okay.
One would call that religious freedom, as we talked about. But wasn't it the vision of the founding fathers that there is a separation between church and state? And we now hear the Republicans saying, no, they don't believe in that separation any longer of church and state.
That's a very good point, Bonnie, because the founders, I mean, put yourself in the context of those people in the 18th century, and they were only decades or a century away from horrible religious wars all over Europe.
Mhm.
And they saw the consequences of trying to establish a state religion. And
Yeah.
it's very clear if you read the writings, you got to read the writings of some of these people. And the writings of Madison, of Jefferson, as they were working on Madison on the Constitution, Jefferson on the Declaration of Independence, that um, we're we're separate from religion. We're not a Christian nation. George Washington wrote a famous letter to the synagogue in Newport that Jews were welcome in this country. This wasn't a Christian country. As long as people were law abiding, they could they could worship any way they pleased, and that was really where the founding fathers were. They may have used the term God occasionally in documents, but they were not saying you had to choose among religions or there was going to be a state religion.
I appreciate those comments. Now we're getting to the end of time for this particular interview, but I would like us to wrap up so that we can leave people who chose to tune in today with some words of wisdom for 2024 and the importance of democracy being on the ballot. I'd like to hear it from Bonnie and also from Mike so that we can have something to hold on to.
I'll start, Mike, on this one. This is a very, very, very critical time in our country, where one group of people is trying to really rule the other and take away freedom itself, which is what they keep saying the Democrats are trying to take away is freedom. Um, and, we didn't talk about independence, but I think it's really important that we make sure to hear and listen and address independents because they are a huge voting bloc. And I think they are the ones that are going to end up putting over whoever wins, whether it's Biden or it's Trump. And young people are also a very, very important voting bloc. And they don't understand that their freedoms will be taken away because they've always been raised with these.
Mm.
They don't know any difference. And so I think those are the main important takeaways that this is a very critical time. Like Mike said at the beginning, we hear this all the time that this is the most important election, but this really is the most important election, at least certainly of my lifetime, and I think most of the people here in the United States.
And I will just add to that. It was very good points, Bonnie. Um, with regard to young people, one challenge the Democrats have, young people tend to be overall um, more liberal and conservative. Young people 18 to 29, in fact, are the only generational cohort where there are more people who say they're liberal than conservative. Um, the majority of them identify as Democrats.
Mhm.
And so there we do have a leg up. But one problem we have is that although we tout democracy, when you have a lot of these young people haven't seen a really good working democracy in
Oh,
their lifetimes. And
mhm.
so I think we need to be positive and show them what democracy can bring. And that's why I'm been saying that we need to talk up the positives as well as talking about the negatives of the Trump administration, but the positives that a Biden and Democratic victory will bring, and what democracy can bring to this country, as it has in the past. America is a work in progress. It's not perfect. It's never been perfect, but even during the course of my lifetime, I've seen changes, and they've been for the good. Um, Maybe it's sometimes two steps forward, one step back, but we're still taking the two steps forward. Um, as Barack Obama said, I think it was also Dr. Martin Luther King, the arc of history is long, but it points in a positive direction.
I think those are wonderful words to leave on. Mike, you've been just great, giving us
Well,
something to
thank
hold
you.
on to, those old slogans of positivity, telling us that young people are the key and they believe in the same democratic principles that some of us who are older grew up with, but it has not been evident in their life. I think connecting the dots and remembering that together we are one, and if we can move forward with that kind of energy, I think we'll be victorious in November
Well,
in
thank
2020.
you, Darrell, and thank you, Bonnie. I appreciate everything. And again, I'm always willing to come back with you all if there's anything else you need.
I think you're going to hear from us again. So thank you
Okay.
very much,
I
Mike.
look
And thank
forward
you
to
so
it.
much, Bonnie, for joining us today.
And thanks, Darrell, for making this happen.
We'll be doing it again. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
You too. Thank you.